Morning everyone, my name's Mark. Thanks for having me here this morning. It's always good to come back to the peninsula. I spent a fair chunk of my childhood down here with my auntie who lived all her life down at Redcliffe, so it's a good feeling to be coming back. Today what we're talking about is your repair and maintenance obligations with respect to common property. Now, when I generally give this presentation, at the end of it I get inundated with questions, and the first question I ask the person asking me that question is, well, what type of scheme do you live in? And invariably the answer is, I don't know. So I thought the best way to start this presentation was just to talk very briefly about the types of schemes, because the type of scheme has a fundamental impact on the repair and maintenance obligations of the body corporate. There's some material that I've left with you. One is my presentation today on repair and maintenance. But with respect to types of schemes, that'll be just on the PowerPoint behind me. I've also left some notepads for you. They're the longer ones with Activ Lloyds. They make great shopping lists. Please take as many as you can because we've changed our street address. So the street address that's on them is old, so they're absolutely free. All right, types of schemes. Now, the first type of scheme is a building format plan. That's probably the most common type of scheme, and I guess the fundamental question before we talk about building format plans is, where do you find out what type of scheme you live in? Well, the answer to that question is on the survey plan, the registered survey plan that creates your scheme. So when your scheme is established, what happens is the developer will lodge a survey plan which essentially subdivides the original lot, and the developer lodges the first CMS. On that survey plan is a very tiny little box, and it simply has format. And in that little box it'll either say building, standard or volumetric, and that's the only place you will find what type of scheme you live in. For what it's worth, my view is a better place to put that information, or an additional better place to put that information, is in the community management statement, because that's where everybody looks to with their bylaws. It's for those living in community title schemes, it's a reasonably familiar document to everybody. So simple statement on a community management statement as to what type of scheme you live in my view, is the better option. But at the moment, we just look at the survey plan for the little box. Now, the building format plan, as it says up there, it's utilised for the subdivision of a building. The easiest way to think about it is, if you're in a vertical building, you're going to be in a building format plan. Essentially, it defines the land using structural elements of the building. For example, the floors, the walls, the ceiling. So if you go home today and think, okay, I live in a high-rise, then by and large it's going to be a building format plan. They have, government's made it a little more complicated. You can be living in duplexes now with shared walls. That can be defined by a building format plan, whereas in the old days, under what was then the building units plan, duplex didn't get captured by that. So I think it's probably fair to say most developments that we deal with, certainly with respect to repair and maintenance obligations, relate to building format plans. The next type of development is a standard format plan. That picture's probably a little bit misleading because, as I said, you can now do common walls through building format plans, but a standard format plan is a subdivision of land. Sorry, that just got very loud. Is a subdivision of land used, identified by marks on the ground, and the classic example is your gated community. Now, the reason I say that most of the repair and maintenance questions we get relate to building format plans is because under a standard format plan, sometimes the common property is simply the driveway. Everything within a standard format lot is the owner's responsibility. So often the common property in a body corporate that was created by a standard format plan is simply the common property road, maybe a swimming pool, maybe a tennis court. Now, the other plan that we come across somewhat regularly, and it's certainly getting more popular, certainly in the CBD, is a volumetric plan of subdivision. Essentially what they are is to utilise different ownership in a building. So in that example there, you've got retail on the ground floor. That can be subdivided so it's a lot by itself and it sits outside the body corporate structure. You've got a club on the second floor. Again, that can be a lot by itself, sitting outside of the body corporate structure. You've got a hotel, which might itself be a body corporate, but because it's a hotel, it might be in the accommodation module. So that will have its own body corporate. Up the top you've got residential, and the appropriate module for that might be a standard module. So that's its own body corporate. So in that scheme there, you've got two body corporates and two lots which sit outside the body corporate structure. So the residential lot will have its own community management statement and its own responsibilities to its owners. The hotel will have its own community management statement and its own responsibility to its owners. And the document that ties all of that together, which you may have heard of, is called a building management statement. And the building management statement regulates the rights and obligations between everybody within that complex. Very quickly, I'll just mention some other schemes that we come across. We have layered arrangements. That's where you've got what we call a principal body corporate, which sits on top, and then you have subsidiary schemes. Often that's used, and they can get very complicated, but often that's used, for example, certainly in Brisbane, where we're having what we call those battle axe subdivisions, where you might have a house, an old Queenslander at the front of the block, and at the back of the block they'll put maybe 6 units, for example. You could utilise that type of arrangement so that you've got a principal body corporate, then you've got another body corporate if the house is subdivided into, say, 3 units, so that's its own body corporate. Then you have another body corporate for the newer units at the back. And the reason that works is because the newer units by rights, because of their age, will tend to have less maintenance obligations early on than the subdivided house, for example. So if the house needs painting, that's an issue for the body corporate that has the house within its scheme, whereas the units at the back have their own body corporate, and that body corporate can deal with their repair and maintenance obligations. Very quickly, the last one is a stage development, and that's more to, I guess, facilitate development, not necessarily in tough times, but a developer might want, for example, 80 units on a block, but because of cash flow problems, he might want to do it in 4 stages of 20. So he can develop stage 1, which is the 20 units, leave a balanced development lot, develop the balanced development lot 2 years down the track for another 20 units, and so on and so on. So it assists with cash flow problems and market conditions. But they're reasonably common. All right, so that deals with the types of plans. There we go. So now if you can refer to your repair and maintenance handout, but the question I'm first going to ask you is, given that I've now discussed the types of plans, how many of you know what type of plan you live in? Right, and how many of those that you know, is it a building format plan or a standard format plan? Building? Yeah, so a mix? Okay. Well, what we're going to talk about first then is the repair and maintenance obligations, irrespective of the type of plan. And it is a fundamental obligation of the body corporate to repair and maintain its common property. Now, in my view, it's probably the most important obligation of a body corporate, because it's the one where if the obligation is not followed through on, it's likely to get the body corporate in a whole deal of strife, and potentially the committee members in a whole deal of strife. But we do need to bear in mind that there is a difference between a repair and maintenance obligation and the ability to improve the common property. So with repair and maintenance, that's essentially fixing something up that has become dilapidated. Obviously improving common property is enhancing the common property that's already there. The body corporate's under no obligation to enhance common property, to improve common property, but it is most certainly under an obligation to repair and maintain its common property. And I can't stress enough that that is an absolutely strict obligation, and we'll talk about the strictness of it a little bit later on. Just out of interest, I was in New Zealand recently, for a body corporate